very much. Good to be with you today, and once again, congratulations to AES23 on 10 years. It's been an amazing 10 years. A quick introduction of myself. As of this week, I am CTO of Appear. Previously, you will have seen me as part of Nevion, where I was Chief Technologist there, and before that, a long time ago in BT, where I headed up their broadcast technology solutions teams. Too early in the morning to say that. So where I come from, in case you didn't guess from the accent, I'm from the UK. I'm on from the East Coast in a little town called Felixstowe by the sea. I'm going to be trying to cover a few aspects of timing with relating to digital video and digital audio in a production environment in the next few minutes. A few other people have been bemused by time over the years. A few famous faces that had some challenges with time. But before we get into the detail, I just want to reiterate a principle that I talked about very briefly yesterday. You can catch that presentation, I'm sure, and catch up. More and more of the way we do production in IP now is in a distributed manner. And what I mean by that is no longer are we constrained from doing everything in a single geographic location with everyone co-located. So more and more of the way we do production is in this distributed manner. And the reason we're doing that is actually it saves the planet, because we don't have to do so many truck rolls, so many aircraft flights, etc. Also, it means we can make more effective use of people if we can actually let them work where they are. And also it means we can make much more effective use of resources, processing resources, if they're centralized, and we can actually share those resources. And there are countless examples that I've been involved in deploying in the last couple of years where we've seen that. Having said that, there are a few fundamentals that come into play once you start talking about going outside of your facility, of your production room, to the big wide world. And one of those is the interconnect and the acceptable latencies that exist, and the way you do timing when you're actually in more than one location at a time. And we're going to look at some of these areas. Fundamentally, what I've tried to do is split up there. You've got acquisition, where the way you're actually capturing your audio, your video, where you're actually doing the processing, which obviously can be a different location, where you're doing the control of that, and where you're actually doing the monitoring, and all of those can be different locations. So those are the key things where the latencies between those can actually impact, and not just the latency, but the way you actually do the timing between those. I'm going to try and unpack some of these. It's going to be a pretty fast-moving skim through stuff. If you want to talk to me more, then do catch my email address or cell number at the end, and I'd be more than willing to actually talk through them afterwards. There is one physical fundamental law that we cannot get around once we go off campus, and that's the speed of light in fiber. So just a couple of examples here. So LA to New York, roughly speaking, it's a 40 millisecond round trip just on the light in fiber transit. That's a non-negotiable. Similarly, if you're looking to go from LA to London, then roughly speaking, it's 100 milliseconds round trip, and that's excluding any router propagation time. That's just the speed of light in fiber. The only silver light on this, or the only shining option that actually helps us this, is there is hollow fiber that's been worked on, that some people are starting to do tests on to roll out, and actually that actually means we can speed this up, because that goes 3 times 10 to the 8th the speed of light in vacuum rather than in glass. So we can actually do 50% better than this once hollow fiber's rolled out, but that's really going to be the end of the line. There is no going any better than the speed of light in fiber. Now, moving back to just thinking about timing and time and latency, and especially when we're in different locations, how timing relates to each other, we need to jump back probably a couple of 100 years to actually say when was the relative timing of different locations really important? And the first time was railways. That's the first time where the time in one location was important to be correlated with the time in another location. And obviously we've learned a lot in the last 200 years since that's been important. Next question on time is, where do we get our references from? Those of you that are old enough might remember ringing up the speaking clock to see what the time was. That's where you got an accurate point of time. Watches, I used to have to reset my watch on the pips that we had in the UK. Now my watch just tells me the time, and I'm confident of that. But the question that then belies is, what is real time now? Now, I used to listen to the radio on FM, and I knew that there was probably only a few milliseconds of delay between where the radio program was being produced and when I listened to it at home. But now I listen on actually Sonos speakers most of the time in different rooms, and I'm actually very aware that those pips that the BBC in the UK still put out on the hour, when I listen to them, they're actually probably about 12 seconds behind when they're actually intended. Now, the purist in me used to rail against that, thinking I cannot cope with the concept, that's not actual time. But I've actually learned to live with it, and it's really not a problem. So we actually learn to cope with these time offsets as long as they're not really problematic. And just diving back into the history of television, just for one reflection on this, the very first process demonstration by John Logie Baird of a system of television, I think this is in 1936 in London. The system he developed to demonstrate this, he only had a flying dot scanner that worked in a darkened room, so he couldn't have a live television camera on a soundstage and actually film television live. So what he did was he actually had a film camera which he had a live development process in. So the film was actually developed, it came out, it was developed live and telecinied with a flying dot scanner. So there was actually a 42-second latency from the studio floor to the actual electrical signal that was sent out in 1936, simply because of that mechanical process. And they actually learned to live with that. I think from what I gather, queuing was really difficult because they had to have a stopwatch, and 42 seconds later they'd prod someone to say, okay, this is the moment you need to be aware of. But we learn to live with latency if it actually is if it enables us to help do the production. And again, my talk yesterday referred to a few things you might like to pick up on there. So timing references, getting everything together. There's the good old analog AM transmission of timing that's there, but most of us now use some kind of GNSS reference for everything we do. And certainly in the world of AES23, which we're celebrating today, and in the world of 2110, everything we do is synchronized, typically using GNSS references, although there are other ways of cracking that, and we'll look at that a bit later on. And there's been an evolution in the way we do timing referencing. We've gone from the last 90 years of having some kind of black burst reference where we actually take the signal and actually propagate a reference signal to all of the devices in the chain. And really what we've done in the last 10 years with AES23 and then SMPTE 2110 is move a similar thing like that in-band over the IP network using PTP. Now, in terms of the way we time, so I'm jumping between timing references and latency and timing as I go through a few things here. We actually have some fundamentals in terms of the way we actually handle processes. We have an origination time. That, to be honest, is the one most important element of time that we need to worry about when we actually do a production. The origination time, the capture time. What we have then is a whole load, and I'm going to expand on this a little bit later on, of associated transport time. So that's the transit. That may just be within a facility a microsecond of propagation time through a couple of routers from your device. We then have processing time, and there's a whole load of different devices in the chain that have more or less deterministic processing time that we need to allow for. Then the distributed time, then the time at which we consume it. Bear that in mind as we move to this next picture, which I've been putting up pretty well in every presentation I've been doing the last 18 months, because I think it's really important for us to understand where our industry is heading. More and more of what we're doing is becoming software-based in terms of the processing. There is always going to be, excuse me while I get my cup of tea here, there is always going to be a real-time acquisition process. So whether you're sampling with your microphone at 48 kilohertz, 96 kilohertz, or if you're a real purist, 192 kilohertz, and then your actual video frame rate of whatever in the UK, we do a nice integer 50 frames per second, but I know over here you do some strange fractional frame rate. But whatever that is, your acquisition is a linear process. Similarly, at the far end, when you're consuming that as a person on your phone, on your television, whatever, on your tablet, that's a real-time process. Most of the process in between there has traditionally been a very linear propagation of signals that's rippled through processing equipment in real time and is then used by the production team and the end consumer. Less and less of that is now a linear real-time process, and more of it will become non-linear. So if I just extrapolate to here, you know, your acquisition is linear, the render on your device to your consumption as a human being is linear. The rest of it doesn't need to be. And as we move to a more end-to-end software chain with compute-centric concatenated processes, it's actually better that it stays non-linear. But if you remember what I was saying about origination time, that's the key thing that we need to be aware of. As we ripple through here, it's the origination time, the moment in time where we captured that video frame, where we captured each of those audio samples. That's the thing that's crucial as we actually build a production system where we move through here. As we actually talk about connecting stuff together, the thing that's really important is, first of all, the connectivity, the way we actually handle the signals is time-bound. We actually need to know that it's actually going to deliver within a time-bound period. We also need to know that it's integral. We haven't lost data, or we actually have coping mechanisms, and again I refer you to yesterday's presentation. We have coping mechanisms that actually make sure we end up with an integral signal, even if there is actually some packet drop, etc. And then we need to make sure that there is sufficient information in that propagation to allow us to actually retime that signal. Again, just jumping back to give a little bit of a potted history of the last 90 plus years of how we've actually done timing and how we've actually made these pictures work. So this is Betty Bolton. I've shown this picture a few times over the last few years. The very, very first person to appear on television. You'll notice it's actually a vertical scan rather than a horizontal scan. And she was in a darkened room. If you remember what I talked about, the John Logie Baird system, she was actually in a dark room and there was a flying white dot of light that scanned her. So it was a single photo cell, and actually the dot scanned her. But what I wanted to get to is, as we've moved through that, and obviously we don't use CRTs now at all, I would say, or almost not at all, but we've still got the legacy of the way we propagated that that's actually been inherited right through, including into SMPTE 2110, which is the suite of standards that we're actually now using, which effectively embraces AES23 in the -30 and 31 elements. Now, one of the things that's been a bit of a passion of mine over the last 3 years is how we actually reconcile timing of the different media essences. So just rewinding, the whole point about SMPTE 2110 is we didn't have this composite signal that included the video, the audio, all of the ancillary data elements in one signal, because they need to be at different processing points within the chain. So if we can actually separate them, the audio devices only need to take the AES67/2110-30 flows, and similarly the video devices just take the video, and the ancillary data devices just handle those flows. But that does mean there comes a moment downstream where we need to reconcile them together. We need to actually say, okay, we've got our video flows, and there could be multiple video flows, we've got our audio flows, and at some point before we hit the end destination, we actually need to reconcile them together. And the big question that belies that is, if I've actually had different processing chains for the video, maybe for one video compared with another, similarly for the audio, how do I know what latency has been incurred by all those signal processing paths to allow me to reconcile that? And that's something that, to be honest, in both AES67 and in SMPTE 2110, we didn't really make allowances for. And some of the work we're doing, which I'm going to talk very briefly about in a minute, is to actually help us to actually understand how we can reconcile those timings. So we did miss something. Part of the SMPTE 2110 suite was -10, and we did actually make a revision to that in the last 12 months, basically to actually say if I'm a device in that chain, if you think about that concatenated chain, I have the ability to actually say, I'm actually going to honor the incoming, the ingress time of that video frame or even that audio sample, although that's contentious for my friend at the back, to actually propagate the time through the system. So that's one way of doing it, and I'm going to explain actually where we've ended up in a consensual manner in the way we're moving forward with that data a little bit later on. But thinking of timing and timing within production, I also want you to consider the fact we actually, both with the pieces of processing equipment within the chain, but also intentionally within the creative decisions we make during a production, we introduce what I call multiple production timing planes. So pieces of equipment like a vision switcher will introduce a small amount of latency. Similarly, an audio mixing desk, although it's pretty small, will introduce a small amount of latency. We then, if you remember, talking about this distributed production where we're doing stuff in different locations, if we've got remote control surfaces, so someone's controlling something from their physical home, then that actually introduces delay, especially as we're probably going over public internet connectivity. So we've got to allow for timing variation there. And we've got that round trip latency. So we may be talking about a minimum of tens of milliseconds. Remote commentary, that may be someone in a different country, again using public internet connectivity. So we could be talking about hundreds of milliseconds there by the time they've actually taken a proxy in, they've done their commentary and they've sent it back into the system. We intentionally, by necessity, add in something like a profanity delay. We actually are intentionally saying, I'm going to slow this production down by 5 seconds to allow me time to actually introduce that profanity delay. Also, and I reflected on this yesterday, as we introduce virtual reality and augmented reality sets, that actually takes usually multiple frames of video to actually render that. But people will tolerate that and plan that in because it gives you creative value in your production. So we actually concatenate many of these elements and we end up with a final point in time where we know we can reconstitute our complete production. I'm going to whistle through this diagram. I don't need to show it too much but it was just basically showing that you can actually have, especially in syndicated production, multiple production elements that are actually concatenated together, and each of them creates multiple timing planes in its own right. Also want to point out that what I was talking about there in terms of devices that are processing, if you think back to my picture of saying our end destination is a software production workflow where everything is actually connected together as software processes, we still actually have, although the processing time may be less deterministic than we have on traditional processing devices, traditionally that we're used to in the production chain, we still can actually create an end-use time, moment in time, where we actually know is a safe one because of the aggregated elements there. And some of the work we're doing in the VSF GCCG work, which I'll give you a reference to in a minute, is actually starting to look at saying, okay, on my deterministic processing on the left there, be that an audio processing device or a video processing device, I actually know it's N clock cycles, N clock ticks. Now we actually say, okay, my software is going to produce it and it's going to do it within this time, but it's actually a more variable time. And then we have the complexities when we start to aggregate those timing uncertainties together, because we need to actually do the math of aggregating the worst case timing uncertainties as we put those timing planes together. One other quick thing as we rattle through here is to look at the requirements for the precision of time. So we have actually, within 2110 and AES23, we've developed an ecosystem where we're actually doing very, very precise timing of all of the devices in the chain by necessity because of the way those devices work and the way we need to reconcile data together. What I want to actually contend is as we move to a more all-software ecosystem where we're actually concatenating software processing functions together, as long as we have the origin time very accurately determined, so the microphones, the cameras, are actually sampling with a very accurate timestamp, which needs to be of the order of magnitude of a PTP resolution, the order of a microsecond, to actually get us that level of accuracy. As long as we've done that, the processing we're doing in software, be that it on-prem or in public cloud, actually only needs to have a relatively precise time. Something like NTP is more than accurate, as long as when we get to the far end, we actually use a precise time to allow us to reconstitute it. So precise timing within the software ecosystem itself is really not as important as people have been making out. And I'm happy to expand on that out of this if you like. So this work, just referring to the -11, because this is the one ongoing piece of work in SMPTE 2110 that we're doing. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to pull together the ability to reconcile time of these different flows, these different essence flows that are going through completely different workflows. And going back to my picture here with this overlay here, we actually have the concept of that the control system needs to understand the processing time of the different elements in the chain and the link time of the other elements. And actually what we do is math, where we aggregate the different elements of processing of all the different chains, and that means the control system is able to actually provide any element with the relevant piece of information to allow it to reconcile the time effectively by providing it with a number of the buffering it needs to provide to actually align these bits together. I do want to make a call out that in software processing in general and in 2110 in general, we are creating unnecessary latency in the way we do stuff at the moment. And this is something, basically, we used to, in a video switcher, typically from any of the key vendors, even if you've got multiple MEs running, typically maybe 3, 4, 5 lines of video. So we're talking about a couple of hundred microseconds of latency. Because of the way 2110 has been defined, and because some of the restrictions or the mandates of 2110 and we are actually, every video switcher now that runs in 2110 consumes a whole video frame. It presents it back on the next video frame boundary, which is actually completely unnecessary, but we've actually made people do that. Similarly, lots of other processes that happen in flight, especially in the video-centric world, are being effectively normalized up to the next integer frame boundary unnecessarily. So my plea is that in the industry, we actually start getting to think about the necessity to do that. Also, in software implementations, what we're tending to do also is throw lots of frame buffers in, because that's an easy way of reconciling and actually creating very easy boundary points as we go through systems. But in many cases, whole frames of buffering are completely unnecessary, and we can actually significantly reduce the overall production time by actually doing that. We can't do anything about the speed of light, but we can actually do something about a lot of these. So quick plug to say, do come and check out the industry work. These are 2 pieces of ongoing work. If you want more information, it says check it out later today. That's a copy and paste error. That's not actually happening. But do talk to me. I'd like to do that, to talk to you about that. So we need to focus on this linear connection-based workflow, this non-linear compute workflow, capturing time, tracking time, and then, as I've just been talking about, optimizing time. And then we can start to think about this whole process of the acceptable latencies. And this is some study work I'm actually working on at the moment. If anyone has any input they'd like to give to me about their experience from operational world about what the acceptable latencies, and this is everything from the audio in my ear, the tally light coming back, the button press tactile loop as a TD, what's acceptable to you there. I've got some numbers I've got from quite a few people in the industry, but I'm trying to build this picture up. It only remains for me to say thank you for being with us for the last 25 minutes. If you're ever in the UK, actually Starbucks don't do a bad one, but I'd love to buy you a proper, or make you a proper cup of tea. So do reach out if you're there, and I'd like to see you then. Thank you for your time. Hopefully it's been of interest. I'd love to talk to you more if you're interested afterwards. Thank you very much.